In this series of this quarter, the whole thing is called The Spiritual Quest with Guidance from Rahner, and each quarter we're doing 6 lectures, which might be more than one wants to know about Karl Rahner and the Spiritual Quest, but altogether we'll have 18 lectures in this series, and the next 3 now all deal with the church. And it seems especially appropriate to have this topic tonight. Obviously, I planned it this way with the visit of Michael Novak to our campus and the fact that he produced a lot of strong reactions in people and so on helps lead me in, I suppose, into the title tonight, or the whole topic. We are dealing with the question of pluralism in the church, how we would find a healthy pluralism. And of course, the problem that is presented in that regard has to do with polarization. So I want to try to delineate that problem a bit and then see what our mentor during this series, Karl Rahner, tells us about that. Before I proceed, it's probably good to somehow keep the whole business of the church in perspective. Out of all the theological questions, the church is not the most important one. Probably one would think first is the question of God, and also the question of Jesus Christ is central to the whole business. The question of the church should be seen in proper hierarchy of values. It is not as important as some of the other questions that we're dealing with. The church is a secondary reality in a sense. It's not as important as the kingdom. At the end time, there will not be any church anymore. There will be the kingdom existing. So we want to keep that in some sort of perspective. I really had a lot of difficulty deciding whether the numbering of these lectures, giving 3 to Christ and 3 to the church, is not really a proper balance. But there were other reasons why it seemed good to go in that direction. So that's by way of some preliminary remarks. Now, the question then is the problem of polarization in the church. Well, we probably could start out with the fact that we have different groupings in the church today. I commonly list 4 of those. One would be the conservative group that sort of likes things the way they were. They would like to go back to the older times and so on. When people in that conservative group get very rigid, we probably would begin to talk about them as reactionaries. Return to the past. That exists. I don't mean this remark in a disparaging way, but just recently there was a young man at one of our daily liturgies, and during the liturgies at our noon mass, they're done rather informally, like a home mass. And afterwards, the young man confronted me because the people there stayed seated during the Eucharistic prayer. And he was very upset with that, very emotionally churning over that. We were not following the way the Pope wanted us to do it, and so on. He wanted, I think, me to tell the people whether to sit or stand for all of this. So that would represent a position in the church that would move towards what I would think of as this conservative or reactionary position. Another grouping that is common to identify would be the liberal or progressive kind of group. People who generally favor change in the church and like a lot of what happened in Vatican II, would like to see more of that going on, and so on. A third obvious group that is around would be the charismatics, a growing number of people who find their roots in the theology of the Spirit, who are very inspired, have a very emotional side to their religion. They're very Christocentric. They like to talk a lot about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, of praying in tongues and being baptized by the Spirit. They have a fine communal sense of things and so on. Their characteristic gesture, of course, is to pray with arms raised and to sing out in groups and so on. And then finally we have a grouping that may well overlap some of the others here, isolated by Andrew Greeley in his own studies, in which he talks about selective Catholics, or as he calls them in one book, the communal Catholics. And the characteristic of those people is that they hang loose from the structures of the church. If they go to the hospital and you ask them what they are, they say, well, I'm a Catholic. They're going to stay a Catholic. However, they don't much care what popes or bishops have to say. They're not angry at bishops. They're not angry at the Pope. They just don't much care. They go to Mass pretty often. They miss on a Sunday. They're not upset about it. They don't worry about every latest law that's come out from the Vatican or from the bishops. They draw on the riches of that tradition. They will say things like, no one's going to kick me out of this church. It's my church as much as anybody else, but they hang loose from the structure. Maybe years ago they were mad about what bishops said. In 1968 they were mad, but since then they've gotten over that. That was the birth control encyclical in Monte Vitae. They might have been angry then in 68, but they're past that now, and they just sort of go on with their Catholic heritage. Well, I often distinguish at least those four groups in the church. Now, that's just the way it is, and you could probably find more groups. That's a fact. The problem comes when the various groupings in the church become sort of armed camps and think of all of the other groupings around as the enemy, as the people who are on the other side. Now we begin to move into what we call polarization. Now it's a bit where we, all of us in this liberal camp, hang together. We don't really associate with those conservatives in the parish. We pat each other on the back for being nice people and having good ideas and being forward-looking and progressive. We tend to stereotype the viewpoints of the other group over here, the conservatives. If they start to open their mouths and say, well, they're just conservative, what do they know? We don't really deal with their arguments at all. We don't deal with their points. We just quickly stereotype the whole group. Oh, he's a conservative, and we switch off. So that would be something of what would happen, I think, in this business of falling into polarization. It's an unhealthy kind of thing. In that situation, of course, there's really no dialogue going on. There's no real genuine interchange. In fact, after a while, it gets hard to interact with those people. If I get over there in this other group, I don't feel comfortable. I'm on edge, and so on. I like to stay with my kind over here in this liberal group. Well, then, when that happens, of course, in parishes, where then we get friction going on. Then it's hard to make the parish a cohesive unit. Therefore, it even is hard to worship together or to pray together, because the two groups don't talk or interact outside of their gathering for the Eucharist. And the whole business of community, of Christian charity, and so on begins to break down. So that's, I suppose, what we mean by this. Now, you can see this not only would it go on in the parish level, but just adopting, say, the liberal viewpoint here, people would see a whole lot of polarization being foisted on people by the Roman congregations, so that Rome would be trying to tell religious orders what to do and not giving them autonomy. People would be saying, geez, the Roman congregations of Curia, they're cracking down on my hero, Hans Küng. They're even calling the great theologian Edward Skilovax to account and calling him to Rome. Even getting Leonardo Boff down in Latin America. He's dragged over to Rome. Now, I'm afraid that Charlie Curran, one of the guys who was in our Murray Lecture Series, is probably going to be called over there before long and challenged about his writings. So people would say, well, that's causing polarization in the church. That upsets us, makes us angry with what is going on. So the liberal lament would include things like, well, what the Vatican did to people up in Michigan. Some people think that Vatican has a special vendetta out for people in the state of Michigan. Well, it was Agnes Mansour, right straight from the Vatican, these clampers are put on her, and she ends up out of her order and so on. Tony Kosnick, the moral theologian, right from Rome, stripped of his teaching post at Orchard Lake Seminary and so on. So, in other words, many people would say, well, this is what causes this polarization, because Rome is becoming authoritarian and more high-handed, and the heaviness is coming out of the Vatican like we haven't seen for many years since the Second Vatican Council. A young man today was very upset with what was going on at the Mass, that people were sitting down during the Eucharistic prayer, told me in no uncertain terms that the Pope is calling this synod in November, and the Pope, he told me why he's calling it, to straighten out these bishops and so on that are being they're out of line. The liberals are out of line, and the Pope is going to step on them. Well, I will tell you, I wrote this in a recent Reflections article, that many liberal people are precisely afraid of that gathering of bishops. They're afraid that's exactly what the Pope is going to try to do, to put the clampers on much of the reform or progressive movement in the church. Many people, as I said in that article, people who have worked their way through the heaviness of the church, who have sort of liberated themselves from what they saw as repressive strictures, have moved out of a legalism and breathing the free air and feeling good about themselves and their Catholicism and their Christian training opportunities and so on, are afraid now that the gains that they fought for and really tore up in their guts over are going to be lost somehow. The people are going to take away certain hard-won freedoms from people today as a result of the synod that's coming up. So maybe that's some of the ways, too, that people feel this. Well, you could look at this thing, I suppose, from the other side, too. You would find the traditionalists who are upset with these movements, and they find themselves being forced into a polarized position. Cardinal Lefebvre, he says, well, we have to go our own way. He cuts himself off from the main body. They start having their own seminaries. They ordain their own priests and so on. And says, the people say, well, you're forcing us into a corner because you didn't let us have the Latin Mass as we wanted it, and so on. You find other people, Christians United for the Faith, who talk about that same sort of thing, that the faith they love and the church that they honored and grew up in is changing so much that it's now out of step with what the gospel's really all about, what Christ intended for the church and what they had lived for. And so they end up feeling polarized or alienated from this whole business. So you could bring that right down to this last weekend. Michael, a lot of people didn't sleep after Michael Novak's talk. A lot of people just terribly upset. I mean, I ran into a student the other day who was livid. I mean, he didn't sleep that evening. He's just horribly upset about what Michael Novak had to say. There were many people who listened to Novak and just, closed him out right away. They really gave him no chance. In other words, one could see this business of polarization sort of happening right on our campus over the weekend. Some people are even upset that he was here, that we would have had him as part of our lecture series and so on. So that's what I would say is polarization in action, where people are considered to be the enemy somehow, even though they are under that same umbrella as being Christian people. Okay, I'm going to stop there just for a second, and let's do our one-to-one discussion for a minute. Let's just ask the question, how people experience polarization in your own parishes or your own small communities and so on. Why don't we just try to get a firmer grip on the question? We'll just do this for a couple minutes. What I wanted to do at this point is to try to draw out what I think are two contrasting viewpoints in the church, or the way that the polarization is actually going on. And I think that I want to describe what we would generally call a liberal position, and then later describe what we commonly call today a neoconservative position, as representing, I think, two poles in the church. Then we'll turn to Ronner's efforts to try to see how we could get those together. because I think that's where the polarization is occurring in general visions of reality, as I used to call it, two different worldviews in the church today. I want to specify that more clearly. First of all would be the liberal view of the world. Thinking, first of all, internally with the church, I guess what liberals generally want is more freedom in the church. They don't want to feel the heavy-handedness and the strictures on themselves. So they want greater decentralization. They would like the national hierarchies to be more powerful. For example, if the United States bishops, if they decide they want to have confession for kids after First Communion, they could do that and not have Rome tell them that they have to have confession before First Communion. That's a fight that's been going on. They would like to have it so that the American bishops could decide how we handle marriage cases and not just have Rome tell us how to do all of that. So they would like decentralization in many ways, less authoritarian structures, and especially less control by the Roman Curia. They would like religious orders in the United States to have freedom to work out their own constitutions, their own lifestyles, their own ways of living, and so on. Instead of having Rome, have this business of trying to dictate much of what goes on that way. They would like our seminaries to have greater freedom. Right now we're undergoing a seminary investigation. Periodically I'm out giving talks at seminaries. It'll be a time when the observers are coming and everyone's on edge, trying to get everything straightened out, because this report all goes back to Rome, and they get upset with what is going on that way. You know the story of Ken Untner, bishop up in Saginaw. They had a sex education course going on in their seminary. I don't even think it was for the seminarians primarily. It was just a course that was being had up in St. John's Seminary, a place where I have taught periodically. And Ken Untner was nominated to be a bishop. He was all ready to be a bishop, and they heard about this sex education course they had at this seminary, which is as I understand, was an innocuous kind of thing with Christian orientation and so on. Well, he gets called to Rome. They're going to decide question whether he can become a bishop because he was the rector of this seminary where this course went on. So then he's called to Rome, and they have him, go through this whole thing with them. He leaves, gets back to the United States, and they got some other phone calls over there about this course. They call him back again. Took an intervention by Cardinal Dearden, who went with him the second time, to make sure that they would eventually ordain him as a bishop, install him as a bishop. So the liberals would say, we don't want that kind of thing. We would like to have procedures where we have more autonomy and freedom here in the United States. I guess the liberals would generally be in favor of more experimentation, for example, in the liturgy, that we wouldn't feel so rigid about what goes on at the Eucharist, that we would feel that there would be constructive experimentation, for example, with alternate Eucharistic prayers, that in average parishes there would be a variety of liturgical expressions, where there could be folk music or classical kind of music, where there could be liturgical dance, or different ways of trying to enhance the liturgy. I suppose that liberals generally are in favor of a more ecumenical approach to things. Their feeling is that it's time to get united. Much of the liberal literature is about forming a federated church where we would actually get together. My own mentor, Karl Rahner, in that liberal camp would be saying, hey, we got enough unity now among the churches. What we ought to do is just declare ourselves united. There's enough unity to accomplish this already. A whole lot of the liberal agenda concerns the status of women in the church, the feeling that there has to be a greater role for women, that women can't be kept in second-class citizenship in the church. There is, in that movement, as part of it, a tendency to be in favor of the ordination of women. and to move in that direction. A lot of infighting going on over that kind of question. There's the need to introduce more democratic procedures into the church. The liberals would want to have parish councils, for example, who would have a whole lot of say of how things go. They want a stronger voice for the laity in the diocesan policy and in parish policy. More democratic procedures all the way along the line they would like to see. And I think they would also be in favor of what Hans Kung called a voluntary renunciation of power on the part of the Pope. And Rahner himself talks about that, as saying that the Pope in the new world, in a more liberal world, would have to function in a different way. He would have to renounce some of his power. Rahner even says at one point the power of appointing bishops, which anybody can understand the social psychology of organizations knows that's how you can keep it all in order. If you've got the power to appoint who the other people in power are, then you can keep control of it all. That's one of the strange things about the existence of Pope John the 23rd. The system should have never produced anyone like that. No one should have been able to rise up in the ranks like that who could so break out of the mold, because the whole system's designed to only allow the people to move forward in the hierarchy who conform and who are in line with the general thinking of the people at the top and so on. It's bound to be. They pick who's going to be the bishops to begin with, and they're the people who control whether they move forward or not. In that kind of system, you really shouldn't get a John the 23rd. And yet, I guess the Spirit has strange ways of working. And, well, John thought he'd throw open some windows. He didn't care what. You know, when he was in there, he found his own file in the Curia. And it was when he was the Pope. You know, then he had access to his own file, and it was quite a damning file on him, on some of his activities. I guess he wasn't too happy that day when he discovered that. Anyway, so the liberal agenda is saying things like that at an internal level. You could probably expand the list. People know as well as I do the kind of things that people would want to see. Now, by strange circumstance, I would say what happens at when we think externally is that liberals seem now to be moving more and more on the side of the bishops and the Pope. You know, a person like Gregory Baum, when he was here, he says, you know, it's amazing. He said he spent all those years criticizing the bishops, and now he finds himself agreeing with them on the things that they're writing. Well, that's an interesting switch. And as we'll see when we look at the conservatives, it's moving in the other direction. So the liberals sort of generally like it when the bishops speak about or write a letter on the economy, or come out in favor of the farm workers, or against capital punishment. When they write their letter on racism in the United States, liberals seem to like what is going on that way. In fact, there's a general feeling in the church that the hierarchy or the church leaders have moved to a more liberal stance. I have a theory on why this has happened. And I think that the reason is because people in power positions get interviewed by Time magazine. And when that happens, I mean, if somebody puts a microphone in front of you and says, what do you think about capital punishment? Well, I mean, you're forced to think about it. In fact, that's much how our bishops work on committees. You know, I'm doing this pastoral letter for them on higher education campus ministry. Well, most of the bishops don't care about that. They're not interested in it. But there's a small group of bishops who get on a committee and they say, we want to push campus ministry. So they say, the way we're going to do this is write a pastoral letter. And then they take that to the bishops and say, well, we're going to want to write this pastoral letter on higher education campus ministry. The other bishops, well, why not? So they vote for it. But then what happens, you see, they produce a draft, and now in April, that draft will go to all the bishops, and the bishops will be asked then to then talk to the people in their diocese who are concerned about higher education, and they'll have to learn something. I mean, they'll have to actually listen to what college presidents are saying or what students are saying or whatever. And in that process, they get educated. It's much like, I think, happened with the sisters in the United States. The reason that the more liberal, progressive element in the whole Catholic Church are the sisters is, I think, because Mother Superior said, go to summer school. You got to go study. And now we got to vote on things and decide what we're going to do and so on. And then people had to educate themselves. One of the reasons the clergy, are not so much in the liberal ranks is precisely the opposite, because bishops didn't have the power to tell them to go to summer school, or couldn't do that to them, or they didn't figure out how to do it. They didn't say, weren't able to accomplish that. Go get educated. Go study the new things. And so the clergy, by and large, end up being the group in the church that is, doesn't partake, I would suppose, of that more liberal world. So, externally, it seems strange that the liberals find themselves largely on the side of those people of the hierarchy, and the hierarchy itself through the whole 20th century tends to be liberal in social questions. So, beginning with Pope Leo XIII in 1891, who wrote the great encyclical defending the right of laboring people to organize, right on through the support of the American bishops for the farm workers, and the latest things on peace and the economy, you tend to get a more liberal kind of stance externally. So, what I tried to do is suggest a vision of reality. Now, no one fits that exactly, you understand. I mean, we don't really have, a number one liberal walking around who espouses everything like that and perfectly fits. That is what we call a typology, a liberal model, a general interlocking set of ideas and presuppositions and programs that tend to make up what we generally call the liberal movement in the Christian churches today. Now, let's look at the other side of this thing. Now, what I'm going to do is, building on Michael Novak's visit, is share with you his notions of where we're at in the church and what is going on. Now, Novak generally in the popular press is called a neo-conservative, although he himself prefers to be called, as he said, a biblical realist or an integral humanist. Those are the words he likes to describe himself, and I think he should be allowed to do that, I suppose. However, generally, he is talked about as being a neo-conservative. Now, and he is such an articulate, representative figure in many ways, although I believe you'll find that many conservatives will not exactly go along with what he says, but it's a way at least of constructing this model here. And it helps us to get an idea of what these people are thinking. Now I will divide my material the same way, internally and externally. So internally, I think the feeling is that the liturgy has lost a whole lot of the sense of mystery. That the real sense of worship in the modern way of doing the liturgy has been lost. It's like having a club meeting, like being at the Kiwanis or something. No sense of the transcendent God being present there. Novak likes to talk about the fact how much he loved the silence around the consecration in the past, and it seems to him now that the greeting of peace has become the more central point of the Mass than the consecration itself. I'm trying to be fair to him. It was interesting. I showed him the article that I wrote comparing his position with the bishops on a question of poverty. It's always neat to get people's reactions to see. And I asked him point blank, whether he thought I treated him fairly in that. And he said that generally he thought yes. He said at one point he felt that I did not see enough how Scripture and theology was woven into his own position, that I shortchanged him at that level. So generally felt that I had represented his position fairly, which is, I think, what one ought to try to do. Well, anyway, that's what I'm trying to do now also. Although I do not share that position, I'm trying to enter into it in an objective way. He feels that the folk songs, the music we sing, is too joyful, too upbeat, and lacks a sense of tragedy and of failure and of sin. Makes a comment that to him a lot of country music sounds more realistic than church hymns these days, which speak nothing but of joy and peace and love and so on. He thinks that theology has been listening too much to the world. He thinks that people like myself who do contemporary theology are too attracted by the fads, too taken up by the current movements in the church, and do not maintain enough critical stance and judgment upon what goes on in the world. These people like to point out the great problem since Vatican II. You know, it's quite interesting. You know, when you compare the bishops on poverty with Novak, you know, my sense was the bishops are showing how bad the problem is, and Novak is saying, well, it's not all that bad. $45 billion and we could solve it like that. So when you move to the way the church has gone since the Second Vatican Council, Novak picks up all of the negative figures, and he looks through all the world, how mass attendance in France is, you know, down to something like 14% in the Catholic community on a given Sunday, something like that. Vocations down to the priesthood and sisterhood down all over. Loss of nuns in the United States. He cites all of these statistics to show us that things have gone badly for us since the Second Vatican Council. He himself once wrote a book called The Open Church. During the Second Vatican Council, he was over there and applauding the fact that the church was opening up. John had opened the windows and all that. Now Novak says that it's too open, that there are no lines drawn. There is no sense of what is orthodox. You know, that every question is open, and that causes people not to know where they stand or where they fit. And he cites examples of articles in the NCR. NCR is something, you know, he doesn't like that too much, although now and then he has an article in there. Well, it's like that, you know, you say, like, a lot of times when I'm out giving talks, people will not enter, you know, in my little vita it says columnist for the NCR. Well, very often they will just scratch that out. Because as soon as you say a columnist for the NCR, then you're stereotyped as one of those, in Novak's mind, one of those far-out liberals that, you know, we're not in touch with reality, I suppose. So he says it's too open. We've not demanded enough discipline in the church. He says that the priests have lost their unique role. Priests have become nothing more than counselors like anybody else. Priests are community organizers like anybody else can do it. So what's special about it? You know, what unique position does the priest have or not? And because of that we've lost our prestige, we've lost our power, I suppose, in many ways. Here's an odd thing. I think this is a little idiosyncratic, really, but he talks about the upsurge of Scripture studies, the interest in the Bible, and that is taken away from the rational, philosophical, careful, thought-out theology. So he said too many people, I think he feels, are jumping on the scriptural bandwagon and losing their intellectual approach to what Christianity is all about. Oh, he doesn't like it that Gregorian chant has been lost. Much of what was good in Thomas Aquinas' theology is gone. That upsets him. And generally, he talks about the charismatic style, that we become more like Baptists or Methodists, he says, and have lost sort of the distinctive, sober character of traditional Catholicism. So that's briefly what he would be saying about internally in the church, where he thinks it's gone badly. And he thinks that, what is the title of one of his chapters? The Smoke of Satan. The Pope John wanted to open and let the Spirit in, but the smoke of Satan, he says, quoting a phrase from Pope Paul VI, somebody who Michael Novak does not really like at all. He would be the worst of the modern popes in his mind. That the smoke of Satan has entered into the church, and we've lost what it is that has made us to be Catholic people. Now, externally, he feels that what has happened is that we have become, the Catholic community is moving, the liberals especially, to becoming too anti-establishment. That happened, he thinks, in the Vietnam War, that it happened then in opposition to much of what the church authority wanted to do, and that it really has produced a situation where people now end up hating America or hating the church. One of our students who challenged him in the afternoon in one of his comments, later on Novak made a beeline for him and wanted to corner him and talk to him. And one of his questions, which he uses all the time, is, who taught you to hate America? Who taught you to hate these good things that we have? In other words, that's part of his sense of what has happened since the end of the Second Vatican Council, that there's almost this self-hatred that he thinks that liberals get involved in. Oh, he says things like, Vietnam, instead of being a mistake, as I suppose he would like to see it in some ways, he says that Vietnam becomes a symbol of a total American imperialism. Just a symbol of what we're always doing, rushing around being the world's policeman. And of course he says that that's off base and not to see the whole thing, right? He doesn't like it that the liberation theologians, when they look at the world out there, use Marxist categories to do that. Dom Helder Câmara, the Brazilian bishop, is often the target of Novak's blast on that, because Dom Helder said that today's world, it was important, in his world, and he's the bishop of Recife, Brazil, and that he has said that in looking at their situation there, that the Christian theologians can well use the kind of analysis that comes from Karl Marx, so that there is a dialogue between Marxism and Christianity. That's what goes on, in part at least, in liberation theology. And Novak has little use for that whole approach. I don't know what this is going to mean to anybody, but the really greatest American theologian today, I think probably Novak would admit this, as almost everybody, whether you're liberal or conservative, is David Tracy at the University of Chicago. An absolutely brilliant man. Well, he does an analysis of American culture and what's going on, and in his analysis he uses four main figures to look at it. There are people like Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and so on. They're all Europeans. And Novak just castigates him for that. He says, well, where's Madison and Jefferson and John Dewey and Emerson and all of the people who have analyzed their own country? Where are the Americans in this? So, I mean, that probably doesn't mean anything to everybody, but the point of it is that he says we are not looking at the American experience. He says liberals keep looking to Europe to get their signals. Like he would say, well, I keep looking at Karl Rahner to get my signals about what is going on. And that's not good. You shouldn't be looking to Europe. We ought to be looking here in the United States for our own culture in trying to see how that could enrich our understanding of what Christianity is all about. But most of all, I guess, what he doesn't like is what he calls the new idealism. He thinks that the liberals are really got these wild dreams, that they have forgotten the doctrine of original sin, that liberals think if we can just get the structures off our back, that everything's going to be beautiful and neat. He has a chapter in one of his books called The Perfect as the enemy of the good. In other words, he says that the problem with liberals is they want everything to be great and terrific, and everybody to have equal amounts of money, and everybody to have equal things in school, and nobody fails, and they will all have peace and love and so on. And Novak says that's just totally unrealistic. It's out of touch with the way life really is. And so he really assails what he calls this new idealism, magical utopian solutions to the world's problems that simply don't work. He says the problem with most liberals is that they're socialists, and that socialism has never worked, never will work, and that liberal Christians simply won't look at all of this. You know, Nicaragua. He talks about that. In fact, we had a serious conversation about Nicaragua. Nicaragua becomes a symbol for many liberal Christians. Nicaragua's got to work. I've talked to a number of people who've been in Nicaragua, religious type people, sisters, priests, lay people who are concerned about the gospel. They go to Nicaragua and they come back and they say, "This is fantastic. This is great. Oh, this is the Sandinistas are doing a marvelous job here," and they all glow about that. I've only found one exception to that in my own contacts with people, and you know, Novak just ridicules that, you know, and says, you know, that's a Marxist regime, that people are dreamy-eyed, it isn't going to work, freedom will be lost, etc. It's a good example, I suppose, of the way he thinks that the liberals do not understand the sinfulness, that they think that if you change the structures, that everything is going to come out all right. He has this phrase that he quotes out, and liberals always think that if someone's suffering, it's somebody else's fault. And that if you can just get on that person who's causing it, then everything will be fine. So it's the thing of saying, well, the reason people are poor in Latin America is because of us. It's our fault that people are poor in Latin America. And so we just get rid of us, get us off their back or something, that things would be fine in Latin America. He ridicules that kind of liberal thing. He thinks that the liberals are motivated by rage, anger at the imperfections of the world, angry at the sinfulness and the poverty and so on, and they're in a rage, and therefore they don't think clearly about how to solve the problems. They're just against whatever is going on and say, let's create a better world, but they don't know really how to get there. Okay, something of what Novak thinks external. No, he wants a more sober, hard-headed realism about what is going on in the world. This links him with people like Irving Kristol, out of the Jewish community, who, you know, fall under the same camp of what I guess we would call neo-conservative. Why don't we, at this point, take a couple minutes to talk one-to-one, then we'll have a chance for questions, then we'll take a break and come back and look at some of Ronner's responses. So let's do our one-to-one discussion. Why don't you focus on that analysis of liberal-conservative, see if it makes any sense to you, if you can locate yourself, locate others in those models. Let's do this for a couple minutes.